At Work Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and pay our respect to elders past and present. This podcast is being recorded in the southwest and Western Australia, which is land of the Noongar people. We'd also like to pay our respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from wherever you may be listening from. Welcome everyone to another episode of Candid Conversations with Shaun. In this episode, we have a returning guest, Sharon from Team Cohesion. She's back once again to share her knowledge and experience of how to create more neuro-inclusive work environments. So please tune in, and I hope you enjoy and be able to take a lot away from this episode. Hi Sharon, thank you so much for coming back again to joining us for another episode of the podcast. I know we've had lots of great feedback from our first episode, so hence the reason why we've invited you back. Thanks again for joining us.
Oh, Shaun, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I know last time when we spoke, we were discussing how we can create more neuro-inclusive work environments, and it's been such a popular episode, we thought we would continue the discussion. If anyone listening would like to go back and catch up on our first episode, you can go back and check out episode 20. So Sharon, to get things started, today we're going to be focusing on communication. And I think regardless of the workplace or the industry that you work in, communication is really important, and effective communication is essential and is really important in all situations. To get things started, do you mind explaining some of the differences between communication styles between a neurotypical and an autistic communication style?
Oh, absolutely. And I guess right off the bat, I'd like to say that I think, and this is just my experience only, of course, but in my experience working with autistic people and, working in an organization that was predominantly neurodivergent, that the one thing that I would like people to understand and adapt, the one thing is communication. I think a lot of problems and issues can be sorted with really clear, open, honest, considerate communication. So if there's one thing I think we can do better is communication. And I guess I want to start by just bringing up a topic which you may or may not have heard of, and that's called the double empathy problem or the double empathy theory. Have you heard of that at all, Shaun?
No, I have never heard of it. Please explain more about it.
Okay, so Dr. Milton coined the term double empathy problem, and it refers to when people with different neurologies interact with each other. So research shows that problems with social skills and perspective taking go both ways, and that it's not the autistic person who lacks perspective taking skills. Neurotypical people can't easily take on the perspective of autistic people either. So it means that as much as it can be said that autistic people lack social insight into non-autistic culture and communication, it could also be said that non-autistic people, so neurotypical people, lack social insight into autistic culture and communication. So I'm going to start by saying it's a two-way street communication.
Yeah. I guess we're sort of saying that we always expect that the autistic person needs to change their communication style to fit in with, I guess, with the neurotypical communication style.
You're exactly right. And I know my language 12 years ago when I started doing training and things like that was more aligned to that thinking. And I'm so grateful that we now know that it's a two-way street, that both autistic people have to learn about non-autistic people's communication and social skills, and likewise non-autistic people have to learn about autistic communication and social skills, and neither one is right or wrong. And I guess I'll talk about that a little bit more throughout the podcast, and how we may be able to look at it a little bit differently and see what I mean. So I remember not so long ago, a beautiful autistic lady that I worked with said to me, I find neurotypical communication really quite aggressive. And she said, everyone's always asking me how I feel and what I'm doing and what I did on the weekend and what I think of stuff, and she said, I find that really challenging. And I'd never heard that perspective before, and it's very true. We're quite intrusive.
Yeah, people, why are you sticking your nose into my business? It's none of your business what I did on the weekend. That type of thinking.
That's right. So just to go back to your first question, and I'll start with some of the differences that we can observe. And I'll start by first talking about non-verbal communication. Now, a lot of our communication is non-verbal, and there's no exact percentage on it, but it's high. It's over 70% of our communication is non-verbal, and it has a lot of non-verbal nuances. And neurotypical communication tends to be less direct, with a lot more non-verbal nuances than an autistic communication style. So autistic people tend to be more direct with less or different non-verbal cues. Neurotypical communication has a reliance on non-verbal cues to convey and interpret meaning, and those non-verbal cues can be completely missed. Non-autistic people can interpret a lack of eye contact as disinterest, and that's really important for employment consultants who are working with autistic participants to know that it's not always, it may be sometimes, I suppose, but it's not always a sign of disinterest. In fact, many autistic people dislike eye contact because it interferes with focus, attention, and concentration. So that person may actually be listening to you intently, but being perceived to be not listening or not interested. So that's super important to know that. And the final point here is that neurotypical communication tends to have a lot more emphasis on tone, and autistic people don't have as much emphasis on tone. So that's just the non-verbal side of communication.
And also just want to touch on that. You mentioned up to 70% can be non-verbal communication, but how often do we hear phrases like, oh, you should have read the room, or you can feel a vibe in a room, where a neurotypical person might realize, oh, this isn't the right situation to sort of make this next comment, so they might bite their tongue or not say it because they've read the room, which sounds like it'd be much more difficult for an autistic person.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, there's a lot of contextual sensitivity with communication. So how do we know that we can't say this thing when the CEO is in the meeting with us, but we can say it when the CEO is not in the meeting with us? Like, where's the rule about that? You know, where are the rules about where and when you can say particular things to different groups of people? And those sort of unwritten rules is where it gets really tricky for autistic people.
And it can also come down to an individual's relationship with another person, of how they might be speaking within a room as well, but then you might not have as tight or as good as a relationship, so you wouldn't continue in that same communication style. Again, it's very unclear of the best approach for communication.
Absolutely. And I think if we can just reflect on why something has been said and think, was the intention to offend or be rude or be blunt or be too honest? Or was it just that the person was communicating to you and they weren't trying to offend at all? So you really need to reflect on what the person's saying. And I guess in the instance, you know, I have worked alongside some employment consultants in different DES providers over the years, and I've heard, you know, some stories. So someone in a cafe, for example, might mention something about politics, and a manager might say, you know, the person can no longer work here. But then I see it differently. I think, did we ever tell that person that our communication expectation is that you don't talk about politics at work? And the reason we don't talk about politics at work is because there can be a lot of differing opinions, and we may unintentionally say the wrong thing. So it's just best not to talk about that within a work context. I'm not saying don't have your political views, but I am just saying within our restaurant, please don't necessarily let your political views, you know, be discussed. And so rather than that person losing the job, we need to explain to them what our rules are. Otherwise, the realm of social interaction and communication is incredibly ambiguous. How do we know what's appropriate in any given situation?
In your experience, have you ever found that some autistic people may choose not to speak up in certain situations because they've said the wrong thing in the past?
Yes, unfortunately. Now, there's a few things there for not speaking up, and that is, yes, what history tells me that whatever I'll say will be wrong or misconstrued or misinterpreted, so I'd rather not say anything. There can also be, and again, I need to really stress that I'm only talking from, my perspective and my experience, and none of this applies to every single autistic person at all. I'll just explain some of the different situations that come up in the work environment. And for example, one of the things I've found, and I think it's really important for employers and employment consultants to know, is that when you're particularly distressed, and I've seen this in the workplace, someone is really distressed at work, almost going into sort of meltdown, shutdown type territory over maybe something at work has changed, the manager has changed, maybe there's loud noises happening and there's a bit of a sensory overload of some sort, and you're overwhelmed. Now, that's a time when we expect an autistic person to tell us what's going wrong or what their needs are. And that's a really hard time to find the right words to say what's going on for you, to say what it is you need and, what would help. And I've seen that time and time, in the workplace. So I've helped individuals developing scripts. And just so that when the words are really hard to find and when that person's feeling really overwhelmed, that they've already got a pre-prepared text on their phone, a script that they can send to their manager and say, look, I just need some time out for 5 minutes and things like that. And having very clear rules about who to communicate with if you do need to leave the office or if you do need to have the day off work for some reason. So that's just one aspect of communication I didn't expect to talk about today, but I think it's super important that we realise that that needs extra effort.
And again, that's a really simple adjustment that can really make a big difference in a person's workday and ability to be able to be successful within that workplace.
Yeah, I agree. For some people, it might be just all that they need as a little adjustment so that they can communicate with you. And certainly then when the person's in a calmer state, it's a lot easier then to have a chat to them in a way that they're comfortable with, to talk about what may have caused that situation and how that situation could be avoided, in the future. So you can reflect on what the situation was that caused the stress when the person's in a calmer state.
And how can these different styles of communication cause challenges within the workplace?
That's a really good question. And it causes challenges mainly because we don't understand each other. And so, today's podcast is to hopefully help people understand different communication styles, and be a little bit more understanding. I think if we understand the cultural difference, that's a first step, a really important first step. What can happen, and I see this a lot, across all neurotypes, but what we've got to understand that what might be super important and be a value system for one person is not necessarily the same for the next person. And so it can be really helpful for some autistic people and quite enjoyable to talk about their interests. When an autistic person is really passionate about a topic, they really might like to communicate that. It's actually quite soothing and it's lovely to be able to talk about something that you're quite passionate about and know a lot about. What can be hard is that it might not be the same opinion as the other person or something that the other person values. And so therefore, that may cause a challenge. Again, it can come back to different people's views on life and on other people and on how people are working, what they say and do. There can be differing perspectives on that. And sometimes that differences in communication can cause challenges for that reason.
And I know in neurotypical communication, there can often be a lot of interpretation or assumptions that the other person understand what is being spoken. And, this can actually sometimes be really confusing. How can this be more difficult for an autistic person?
Again, let's just think of it from different perspectives. So As I said earlier in the podcast, neurotypical communication is less direct. We tend to put a lot of social padding around what we're saying. We soften our messages and we have this preamble before what we actually want to say. And autistic people find that social padding completely ineffective and unnecessary. And in fact, it tends to obscure the meaning. And I know I do this myself. I use too many words and I try to soften a message. And in doing so, I can often, confuse the autistic person. So an autistic person is much more straight to the point. An email could be, I need this information now, which is a very effective communication style in a way. It's saying, I need the information and I need it now. So what is it that we need around that sentence to soften it for neurotypical people? That's what's confusing for an autistic person. And I've heard many people say, I spend so long writing and rewriting emails because I know I've got to say something at the beginning. I don't really know what it's for or why I've got to do it. And one beautiful autistic lady I worked with used to put a photo of a puppy at the beginning of each email because she knew that would make the neurotypical person not be angry with her. Like, how could they be angry with me? I've put a puppy at the front, because she didn't quite get the point of that entry sentence.
The warm introductions, how are you going?
Yeah, that's right. And so there's a real difference in perception there, isn't there? Why do we have it? What's the purpose of it, really?
I guess if we're looking purely at a workplace and a business situation, an autistic person's style of communication could be more effective. And what do you think some of the traits of their communication style are more effective?
I think that certainly, there's no social padding. There isn't as much emphasis on small talk. And again, this is not every single person, but there tends to be a view that small talk is unnecessary communication. And what are the rules around small talk? So you can talk about the football, but, I want to talk about my special interest, but why do they not want to hear about that? But everyone wants to talk about the football. So small talk requires an awful lot of effort and doesn't really add to meaning. And unfortunately, over the years, I have heard so many people have lost their jobs because they're not, I've got inverted commas here, my fingers up, not team players. Now, to be a team player, obviously, the autistic people needed to come in and say, good morning, everyone. How was your night? Did you watch that TV show last night? How about that? That was amazing. And then sit down and start working. And so because they're not doing that, they come straight in and sit down and start working, they're the one that's in the wrong. And they can't understand that because neurotypical people are standing around talking about stuff that's not important. So again, look at it from the different perspectives. And unfortunately, though, the autistic people are seen and interpreted as rude or not team players because they don't like to chat about general chit-chat. It's very confusing for them.
It is, I guess it can be very confusing and quite tricky because although that chit-chat is often, it might not be work-related, but it's often goes a long way to help strengthen relationships, which creates better collaboration between colleagues, builds that better connection, where I guess the autistic person might be forced out of that circle because they don't engage in that small talk.
Also, Shaun, the expectation again is probably that they would join in for that collaborative purpose, but it would be on a neurotypical way. Yeah. So we need to actually include our autistic folk in our conversations, but in the right way for them. And that's probably going to take a question. We're going to have to say to them, it may be overwhelming to come forward with information and ideas in a group, for example. So, how can we incorporate you into our team discussions in a way that you're comfortable? Do we email you? Do we text you? Do you just talk to me one-on-one? Or it has to be the way that is effective for that person. And I'll come back to that point, which is just so important, is that we do have neuronormative expectations on communication. And whilst we do that, our autistic folk are never going to be able to communicate with us in a way that will keep neurotypicals happy because they've got a different brain. We're asking a Spanish person to speak English and they don't know English. So it's really important that we understand that we have to adapt our communication style as well. For example, even giving space for the person to process their response to stimuli, whatever it might be, and giving them space to enter a conversation is something that we could do. And just let the person take as long as it takes, within reason, of course, to say what it is they want to say.
And I guess that can be challenging for anyone if you come across or you're stepping into a conversation. It's hard to know where or when to wait for a break in conversation for you to be able to add your opinion or about to add your 2 cents worth. So that again can create even more challenge and barriers for that autistic person.
Exactly. And then when the person enters a conversation, how much is enough? How much is too much? That's another decision that's a little bit ambiguous. And so, it could be at times, like anyone, we may have people in a group that, aren't confident speakers and we need to help them to be included. But there can also be people, autistic and non-autistic, who do love the sound of their own voice. And so perhaps there needs to be some rules around that as well. I once had an employer say to me they'd taken on autistic employee, and it was in a truck yard here in Brisbane. And this young man was speaking to every truck driver that came in, saying hello, stopping and having a chat. And the manager said to me he was a little frustrated by that. And I said, well, have you told that person what your expectations are? And he said, no. I said, well, you need to let him know that he doesn't need to stop and talk to every single truck driver. He thought that's what you would want him to do because he doesn't want to be seen as rude. So just say it's okay to wave and just say hello. But usually we don't stop and talk to every single driver when they come into the yard because we don't get our work done. Again, why do we just assume that a person knows that?
And again, it's setting those clearly defined rules of how they are to communicate. If the rules are laid out, then there's not going to be an issue.
That's right.
Can we finish off today by just discussing a few more of the traits that make autistic communication more effective?
Look, 100%. I'd love to talk to you about something that comes up a lot in the workplace. So a lot of times employers, co-workers will say, well, the autistic person didn't come and ask for more work, or they sat there for an hour trying to work something out. Why didn't they come and ask me for help? And so we could have two sides of a coin here. We could have someone who doesn't ask any questions. Now, what we have to understand there is that the person's probably trying to appear really capable, firstly, and they're not wanting to let you down by having to ask a question and say, I don't understand something or I need some help. So they may not come forward because of that, but they also may not know that they need to ask you a question about that because that means you haven't given the full context of what the task might be or how it needs to look at the end. And so the person may take your communication literally and just do literally what you said and not realize that they should have asked a question at some point. So in that case, you need to check in for clarity. Make sure the person has clarity on what your expectations are. And that way you can pick up any gaps in your communication in giving that work to them. Likewise, sometimes people ask a lot of questions, and that may be their processing style. They may process information better and quicker if they ask you questions about it as it comes into their head. Now, that's great if you are able to answer lots of questions, but sometimes you might be doing some training, for example, and the person's asking lots of questions throughout the training. You may have to say, look, I'm really happy to answer all your questions, but I am probably going to cover a lot of them, in the next little bit. So do you mind just holding off on your questions until the end? So if someone is asking too many and interrupting a lot, firstly understand that that may be helpful for them to process information, and just let them know, look, I'll spend time with you afterwards and make sure that I answer all your questions. So it is okay to put rules around asking questions, and encourage those who don't ask a lot of questions. Encourage them, let them know it's okay to not know everything, because you can be a perfectionist and want to do everything perfectly, but we know that none of us are perfect, right? So normalize asking questions and encourage people to ask questions. My daughter once said to me, she has does a shift in a medical lab, and she has scientists and all sorts of other people working alongside her, and they have scheduled breaks. And she said, I spend, I'm always wondering, am I asking too many questions? Should I be asking more questions about this? Or, can I go to lunch? I like going to lunch at this time, but I bet everyone else is really annoyed with me, but I don't want to go and ask of them if it's okay for me to have lunch at this time. So basically what that said to me is my daughter's spending her whole shift worrying about what to say, what not to say. So if we can just help alleviate some of that anxiety about communication, it is so helpful. And if someone does unintentionally say the wrong thing, check yourself. One, did they mean to offend? Probably not. So that's okay. We can just tell the person perhaps a better way to say it would be this, or, if it was just a private discussion, it doesn't need to be a big thing. But if it's going to be a problem in the workplace, stop assuming that the person knows that's inappropriate to say, and put some rules around it, not in a condescending, mean way, which I know nobody would be. But I always say to myself, if I say this to the person, will it help them develop in their role? And if the answer is yes, I say it because it helps the person develop in the role. If we don't say, you can't talk about that at work, and we let it go and we let it go and let it go, the end result is never going to be great. So we have to let people know what our rules are around communication. And like with any neurotype, you can be rude and you can say the wrong thing. That goes across all neurotypes. There are rules to that, and there are consequences for that as well. So if a person is inappropriate in saying the wrong thing, and for any reason, we do need to take the appropriate actions. We do that for all neurotypes. So autism is not an excuse for saying whatever you want, likewise for neurotypical. So please, we need to let people know what our expectations and rules are around communication so we can ensure success.
Well, Sharon, thank you very much. And just to finish off, is there any myths or misconceptions associated with an autistic communication style?
Look, over the years, autistic people, I guess, have got a bad rap for being rude or blunt or too honest. And, another way to look at it is it's an effective and straight to the point communication style. So, if you ask a question to an autistic person, you may be prepared for an honest answer. And it's not that they're trying to be rude and offend you, but it's an honest answer. Autistic people tend to be very committed to truthfulness, which is a strength. So if we ask a question, be mindful that the answer will be quite honest and truthful. And if it's not appropriate for any given setting, perhaps we need to explain that. And if not, we just need to accept that that's that person's communication style. When a person feels comfortable in a work environment to be themselves without judgment, that means that they are able to remove their mask. So most of the time, an autistic person is trying to guess what it is we want them to do and say, and how we want them to act and what's appropriate. And so if we allow an autistic person to just be their authentic selves and take that mask off, it is so much better for their psychological safety, and it's such a better work environment for them to work in.
Yeah, and I was just going to say before that if the honest response to a question upsets you or offends you, then maybe that's a question that maybe shouldn't have been asked in the first place.
It perhaps could have been reframed. Yeah, it could
Yeah.
have been asked a different way. And so you do have to adapt your communication style, and it's actually not that hard. And it's okay for either side to get it wrong and say sorry as well. You know, nobody's perfect, but I think it's okay for you to ask an autistic person, are you communicating clearly? Is there anything that you can do better with your communication? You know, it's okay to ask those things and have a two-way collaborative conversation around that would be wonderful if you were able to do that.
The workplaces that we all work in these days, they are very diverse, and quite often we have to change our communication styles to allow different cultures and people from different demographics to be able to work together, create an effective and welcoming workplace. So having to adjust your communication style for a person who is autistic, it should be just the same.
Right. I'm glad you said that because we're already doing it.
Yeah.
We're doing it and successfully. And this is just another cultural diversity that we need to be aware of and be inclusive of. So you're very right, Shaun.
Well, Sharon, I think that is a good point to leave it. Well, thank you so much again for coming in and sharing your knowledge on how to create more neuro-inclusive workplaces. I'm sure our listeners are going to take a lot away from this episode. So thank you very much for your time. We do truly appreciate it. Once again, you provided lots of invaluable information.
Absolutely my pleasure. And remember, that's just my perspective. Please ask the autistic people that you're working alongside for their perspective as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sharon. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Shaun.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to another episode of Candid Conversations with Shaun. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Sharon and you feel a bit more informed about different communication styles and how you can support a person who is neurodivergent within your workplace. As always, for any further information about anything we discussed, please refer to the links in the show notes.